So I hope that everybody has had an opportunity to take a look in the book at the sixth realization. I would certainly say that it is an outstanding opportunity to take your learning of Buddhism from the core teachings and now to be studying this book. It is considered in very many ways an advanced sutra, but I certainly think it is one that can truly provide you with an excellent foundation, even at the opportunity to be able to read through and examine from the state of whatever your level of cultivation would be at that point in time. Because we deal with some very, very big concepts, basic concepts here, as we considered the importance of giving, which is the essential message for this. But quite literally is, what does giving mean, and how does it apply from what's in the paper, what's in the sutra, and then what it means to you in your day-to-day life. So I think we should all be here just about now. So I'd like to start the class. I'll ask everybody to rise, please, and we will give 3 bows to the front. So the first bow to the Buddha, please. Second to the Dharma, and our Sangha. Thank you. Please be seated. So just a few words in regards to the 8 realizations. It was one of the first sutras that was translated from Pali into Chinese. It was chosen for several reasons, but I think first upon them, and why it's particularly relevant to us at this stage, is it was chosen because it was very short, it was very brief, therefore something to focus on and be easily understood. It was very, very clear, and it had a very straightforward message in how you could apply it towards your life. And it was very significant when this was brought forward. Of course, this is when Buddhism was being appropriately introduced into China, and it was really an opportunity for the Chinese people to understand what Buddhism was all about at that point in time. And I consider the parallels towards anybody who is either a novice or a more experienced person who is studying Buddhism, because it really is a great stepping stone to really understand some of the fundamental premises of Buddhism itself. So I think it's very solid from that. It is particularly applicable from a Mahayana point of view. Fo Guangshan, as you know, studies Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana meaning humanistic Buddhism, and very much Buddhism not just to develop our own cultivation or our own enlightenment, but we also dedicate ourselves to be aware of others and to cultivate the desire, the ability within ourselves to do good things for other people, to not just enlighten ourselves, but to dedicate ourselves to the enlightenment, the advancement, and literally to remove suffering from all sentient beings. And that really, from my point of view, is the core of what we're looking at here from the point of view of the 6th realization. Very much from a Mahayana tradition, very much a part of that, and very much an opportunity to be able to study what these words mean to us at that point in time, because it really gives us an opportunity, I think, to be able to examine how we live our day-to-day lives, and more importantly, the perspectives, the intentions that we have as we go forward, leading our actions to ourselves and our actions to others. So just before going forward, Caroline, if I could impose upon you just to reread the 6th realization, just so that we've all got a proper foundation.
Realize that those who are poor and suffering have more resentment, and that this leads them to create unwholesome conditions. A Bodhisattva practices giving and has equal concern for friend and foe. He does not recollect past unwholesome deeds committed against him, nor does he hate unwholesome people.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a lot of very, very powerful words within that realization. The thought of treating everybody with an equal viewpoint. The thought of seeing somebody as what we term in a favorable position and looking at somebody else in an unfavorable position. And again, those terms favorable and unfavorable are in our perception as well. But to regard them as equal. We live in a life surrounded by media images, and we live in a life where we are constantly advised, I won't say told, but advised as to what we should consider good, we should consider evil, what we should consider beautiful, what we should consider ugly. We are taught to respect very oftentimes that pursuit of money along the way. Taught the one thing we want to stay away from is not having material things and not having material goods. And that very much comes to that core. The ability to realize that poor and, if you want to use the term rich, have far more in common than they do in difference. As we look towards leading to unwholesome conditions, the idea that the poor or poverty in our society is what leads towards an unwholesome condition within those. That if you are favorable enough to be in a position where you are comfortable, there is an opportunity to regard those who are in a poverty situation as those of being not only the same, but worthy of help and worthy of support at that point in time. And if you consider your own thoughts as you approach a homeless person on the street, or you approach a person walking along in a business suit, I ask you to examine what thoughts flood to your mind as you come forward. And that, to me, is one of the greatest challenges that is presented. That state of mind, that perception that we grow up with, that intention that we have. Do we walk towards the other side of the street when we see something unfavorable? Do we walk towards these favorable images? And where we often talk about what we control in our lives and what we don't control, the thought being is that 10% of our lives we do not control. We do not control the weather. We do not control other people. But the thought being is what we do control is the other 90%. That 90% being our reaction to those situations. And that, to me, is, as a premise, what I would like to have you bear in mind as we go forward to explore this. It also goes on to say, in reference to this, as to your practice and giving equal concern for friend or foe. So not just those of what we would term fortunate and unfortunate, but what we would actually consider as we look towards somebody who potentially has done someone else harm. The first question in the handout asks you to consider the impact of the recent kidnappings of female students in Nigeria. And what was your reaction immediately towards the girls who were kidnapped? And what was your reaction towards the people who were the perpetrators of that? We'll touch on that a little bit later on, but that fundamentally is at the core. The other thing I'd like to point out before we go forward is that ultimate, to me, delusion that allows us to maintain attachments and continue to pursue unwholesome things. And that is that delusion of being able to self-justify. The yes, but. Yes, but this is why I feel this way. Yes, but this is why I give to this person, but I don't give to that person. And that is really at the core of examining it. And I put the path, or I put the comment up here at the beginning, practicing the path versus knowing the path. As we talk about giving, I don't think there's anybody who is raised not to understand what the concept of giving is. We on an ongoing basis are aware of how nice it is to receive a gift. We develop, once we get through childhood, the enjoyment of actually being able to give a gift and seeing the joy on somebody else's face. And yet at that point in time, is this something that we embody and carry with us every day? So as we go forward, that literally is what we need to consider. Talks in the realization about attitudes towards poverty and wealth, and the thought that it has two basic learnings. The first learning being is that both poverty and wealth are impermanent. That at different stages, the one who is rich proclaiming their thoughts, and we see it regularly in the media, a number of barons who are out there who seem to have all kinds of wealth, dictating what others think and dictating what their comments are towards everybody else. And yet those who reach that peak oftentimes find themselves through economic conditions, circumstances, karma, at times to have lost that wealth. And how do then they regard things within them? That lesson of impermanence, that lesson of enjoying the sunshine and allowing others to share that enjoyment, because it will be raining tomorrow. The idea of enjoying the rain, because even if it's something that perhaps does not give you pleasure, the next day there will be sun again. So again, reinforcement of that impermanence. So not to take too much pride or effort in if you are in favorable circumstances and have money, but also not to look down upon and not to be concerned with somebody who does not have the benefit of either material things or other things that we would consider to them. Be in a position to understand that that impermanence does indeed happen to all. The second point would be is that, and this is a strong consideration because it affects a tremendous number of those in Western society, and that is that wealth is not just regarded as material wealth. That wealth is always regarded is also regarded as intellectual wealth, moral wealth, spiritual wealth. The idea that when you can give something, whether you're rich and poor, you have the opportunity to give something to somebody else. And so this concept of giving becomes even broader at that point in time. And it's very critical to examine that. Again, falling back, and I'll use the term, that self-justification, that delusion as we go forward. That idea that I've given, therefore I must be a giving person, I must be a caring person. What we're dealing here now is not a writing of a check and saying I'm being charitable. What we're dealing here with is a state of mind where giving and generosity becomes first and foremost in your thoughts. That is very challenging. In very many ways, it actually goes against how we have been raised. It goes against the examples that we see around us on an ongoing basis. One of the blessings of the Dharma is it allows us to see things through different eyes and through different perspectives. And again, as we're aware from Buddha's point, the Dharma allows illumination for our path moving forward. It does not provide all the answers. What it provides is the learning experience for us to move ahead and to take responsibility ourselves for how we live that life. And that, to me, is a critical distinction between those two things. So just as a little bit of a background for this, I felt within the chapter there was a very good paragraph from a descriptor point of view to talk about the bringing of this realization into the real world. So, Martin, I'll just ask you to read that out, please.
Sure, thank you. The Sutra on the Samadhi, this is on page 103, if anybody wanted to follow along on this text. The Sutra of the Samadhi of Great Merit says, "Rid yourself of passion and hate, and do not let yourself be resentful or mean. Practice compassion, and look upon your enemies as your friends. Nowhere has it been said that we should recognize social or political problems when they exist, or that we should not strive to make the best of a poor environment. The meaning of this realization is not that we should passively accept everything that happens to us, but that we should work to change bad conditions through acts of kindness and giving, and that we should not allow ourselves to become angry or resentful while doing so. Resentment is an inner state that we have the power to control. It is a sign of ignorance and harmful attachment. If we feel that we are susceptible to feelings of resentment, we should strive to monitor our moods and behaviors. The moment we find ourselves feeling resentful, we should stop and reflect on what is causing our mood and why we are choosing to indulge in this negative state."
Okay, thank you very much. And I think very critical that we do examine what was said in that paragraph, because this to me is at the heart which is the taking things in our concept today from the classroom and making it part of our life. Within this classroom, sitting here surrounded by our fellow Sangha, surrounded by the Dharma that we have here, very straightforwardly towards being able to take a look at how we're going to do things. But it's out there in the real world again where we come face to face with these situations and these decisions. Now, you mentioned resentments. There are 4 resentments that are expressly meant. I think it's important that it differentiates, or should I say doesn't differentiate, between attitudes against the poor, but also attitudes against the wealthy as well too. Because it's not just the so-called poor that somebody might have resentment about. It is just anybody outside our circle who is not looked upon as having what we have at that point in time. So the 4 resentments that we look at are resenting the heavens for one's fate, to cursing the gods, as it were, for the karma that you have in front of you. And you think of the benefit or lack of benefit in spending your time focused on that resentment. The resentment towards the environment or social system for the system as we look towards around it. I mean, we've just been through a provincial election which was characterized by words rather than substance, a lack of real emotion and feeling and change for the social consciousness of the people that lived within the province. Very much a focus on what needs to be said towards getting re-elected. And I certainly don't want to turn this into a political discussion, but I think that we can all look towards the things that affect us as citizens of this province, what that government is doing to change things and regulate things for the betterment of our entire society, for improving the things that truly matter and bringing us forward. And I think that very much is a key to be considered. So those resentments of the system's keeping me down. As we come to Buddhism, we do it for the personal responsibility of removing suffering from our lives through actions over what we have control of. To blame something else for the reasons we can't change becomes a very challenging thing to consider.
So what you're saying is the man's keeping you down.
What I'm saying is that for a lot of people, they honestly believe the man is keeping them down, and that's why they cannot move forward. I used that 1090 comment earlier on. There have been times within this classroom and talking about it where people honestly feel 90% of their life is outside of their control. That quite literally they are just a cog in the machine of our society, and there's very little that they can actually change. Yes, we read these wonderful stories about self-made individuals and people who came up through great circumstance and through great challenge, but somehow we always manage to self-excuse or self-delude that we don't do things. We're surrounded by people who want more out of life, who have bucket lists. Why would anybody have a bucket list? A great comment would be is if you had 10 minutes left to live, what would you do with your life? What would you do with that next 10 minutes? And then the comment quite literally is, well, you have 10 minutes right now. What are you doing with your life? And to really consider the opportunities that we have in front of us. How many times people will say, one day I will do these things. Now I realize that if your dreams involve an awful lot of money and material aspects, that you want to travel somewhere, there are costs involved. But what I'm really talking about here is changing that mindset and looking at the hopes and goals and dreams that you do have, aspirations that you do have, and bringing them in the realm where you are considering the Dharma as something that can assist you moving forward there. And that to me is very, very critical. If you truly look as if what holds us down, it is ourselves. We are the ones. There might be temporary blocks within our lives. There might be challenges within our lives, but ultimately what keeps us where we are doing what we're doing is ourselves. If you look at one of the easiest things that we look towards some of the challenges in our society, be it diseases that are within our society, addictions within our society. You could call a whole series of things addictions, be it gambling, be it alcohol, be it food, all these things. And yet ultimately we can give a million reasons why we would overdrink, overeat, overgamble. But ultimately at the end of the day, it's not about somebody making you do something. It is truly about a choice that you do make, whether exacerbated by a sickness, a disease, or not. When somebody is sick from a health issue, you have to modify your life to anticipate. If you've got a broken leg, you can't go for a run, you can't go for a walk. You work towards physical therapy and work towards getting better again. Mental illnesses face a number of more challenges as far as that goes, but can still be approached on a block method of moving forward. So again, that responsibility being ours. The resentment towards those around you, taking it out on those you love, your family around you, your friends around you. If you're at work in a frustrating situation, you come home, the very people that can nurture and support you, including your wife, husband, children, lucky enough to have that family, friends, very often those are the people that you take it out on. If you're frustrated at work, you really do need to examine at the deep down core as to, is that job for you conducive to where you want to be in life? And that is a huge element as we consider that. In fact, as we look at the Noble Eightfold Pathway, as we look towards Noble Eightfold Pathway, and we look at real livelihood or the appropriateness of the livelihood that you're involved in, it's to not be involved in a livelihood that is destructive towards others. And yet that also can be applied to yourself. The destructiveness of a livelihood or job that you are in that is causing you stress, that is causing you to be in a situation that impacts others within your life because you come home angry, stressed out. And again, that is within our control. Possibly not in the short term, but there are always ways and avenues and opportunities with which we can consider a way of breaking it out. Because the idea of continuing within that pathway, creating stress, animosity, raising children to be thought of from that mindset is a very, very frightening thing. And I would think the last thing that anybody would want to have at that point in time. So something very much to be considered. And resentment, the fourth resentment of friends, those around you and not helping you. And very often we do look towards others to assist us. If only somebody would help me, if only I could get some leverage from some other impact, and then that would help me get to where I want to go. That in itself is something that is extremely challenging. That resentment for not having that is something that we certainly need to be cognizant of and to bear in mind. So as we look towards giving, we had talked before about there is not just giving in a material sense, but giving in a moral sense, intellectual sense, also giving from a spiritual sense. Three distinct types of giving are also mentioned, and the beauty of these is that it's not whether you're rich or poor, as we've touched on before. The idea of giving material things for what you have within your ability to be able to give. It can certainly allow you to plant good karmic seeds. There's certainly good karma that's generated from giving to help those around you. It is thought that there can be wealth in your future if you are the type of person who is willing to give without that expectation. The thought of giving the Dharma or giving the benefit of the words of Buddha to others to garner good Dharma seeds can result in wisdom in the future. And the thought of giving no fear or giving emotional support to those around you and to those who require it is also something that's very critical. That certainly can assist you with how you move forward and assist you with potentially longevity in the future. And yet it is also mentioned from the Diamond Sutra that in the meantime, do not forget that with the highest level of giving, there is no giver, no receiver, and no gift. And we'll explore this a little bit more later on, but when you really talk about when you do give, Not only what your mindset is, but what your thoughts are towards the future. As you have expectation towards, once you give, things should happen for you. That expectation when you give. The thought being is to give without expectation. If something happens, it happens along the way. And very, very important at that stage. So I think it's absolutely critical to consider, again, those resentments and that state of mind, as Martin read in the paragraph, to consider those resentments as you look towards decisions that you make or can make at that point in time. It is thought that giving is two-sided, that when you give, you help others, but very correctly, it's also that you're helping yourself as well too. The type of person you are, reinforcing the direction that you want to go and where you move ahead. Now at the beginning we talked about, when we read the realization, and thank you again Caroline for doing that, we talked about resentments towards that poverty that there is out there. Resentments when we turn on the news towards the poor in the world. Resentments towards those who don't appear to be following the course or the actions towards putting themselves in a position whereby they can improve themselves. And I think society has been filled with numerous examples of people essentially condemning, all the way back to the poor laws in England where somebody was put in jail for not having money, to be the point of view where people literally are bound towards whether actual slavery or economic slavery as far as the money that they can make at that point in time, and examine that. Because very often you can find yourself by that, again, self-justification. And I remember when I was young watching a documentary of the poor, in this case it was in England. And I remember the class sitting around, this was in about grade 8, and you would see people smoking, and you would see people eating fast food, and you would see people in a position that they weren't going to school, they were taking school off, and they weren't working, a lot of them. And it was very easy to sit there in that middle class existence of which the class shared and said, well, this is easy, this is really easy to figure out. If they would just quit smoking, if they would just make sure and focus up, if they would get in school, if they would do all these things, they would see their way out of it. And you look at that situation and you look at those mindsets that you have developed at that point in time, and obviously it cannot be as easy as that. Not only that, but there's many things that we're encouraging them to do, or I was thinking encouraging them to do, that literally apply to yourself. If we want to get ahead, we have lots of opportunities to us, regardless of the starting point that we're at that point in time. Very often in cases, it does tend to be multi-generational. The lessons that at one point might be temporarily out of work, you can find in many areas as you look towards, even in Canada's own Maritimes, as we look towards Newfoundland with 3 to 4 generations who have been out of work, as we look towards coal mining in West Virginia, as we look towards multi-generations who have been out of work. The thought being is that what then becomes, I'm going to get ahead and this is all going to change one day, towards more of a hopelessness, towards more of a situation where there really is no, for a lot of these people, light at the end of the tunnel. Instead of going out and having drinks, instead of going out and raising families and doing a variety of things of which economically doesn't seem to make any sense from our perspective. But to regard these people with not animosity, not resentment, to regard people who are in these situations, even though very often they might throw the challenges at us and not want that support, but still to maintain that Dharma in your heart and in your mentality. Very often our society today, and we see it all the time, it likes to build gated communities. Let's keep people out. Let's hire more police. Let's put ourselves in a position whereby if those people want to be that way, we can keep around them. Rather than the understanding and the idea of looking at them and understanding that they, but in very often for circumstance, would be exactly where we are, for the conditions, for the karma that they face within their lives. So very important to be able to consider that. the whole term as we look at from a Buddhist perspective, and I'm always amazed by the modern term YOLO, or you only live once, which from a Buddhist perspective is a wonderful thing. You only live once. Let's realize the opportunity here in front of us every day, every minute in the decisions that we make, living in the present moment to make these decisions. And yet it has become in our modern day culture an excuse to be able to go out there and do the most delusional behavior at that point. Let's drink tonight. Let's have shots tonight. Let's go out to the club tonight. Let's spend our money tonight because we don't know what's going on tomorrow. And yet that really is so opposite to what's happening in the real. And that is something that certainly needs to be considered. I just want to share an experience that I had the other day. I work at Humber College and University of Guelph Humber, and had a woman come in. This was about 2 weeks ago. And she had a test to write because she had missed her original test. She came in and mentioned that she had been sick and she had not been able to come in because she hadn't been able to find out a babysitter. Found out that she must have been around about 30 years of age, had 4 children, was living at Jane and Finch, was working 2 jobs as well as still trying to go through school. She later identified that she actually wasn't sick, but the reason that she was there and was unable to write the test was that she was at high school because her eldest daughter had been involved with a fight. And that fight not only occurred at school, but the parents of the girl she was fighting with actually came to her house and tried to assault her as well too. So as you sit there and listen to this circumstance, and from your background you're going, yes but, couldn't you do this, couldn't you do that, can't you just move from Jane and Finch, find another job? Here you had somebody with 4 children who obviously had made some life choices that maybe should or should not have been made, but that is beyond our control. What we can control is our attitude towards those individuals. Areas of Toronto where you look at and you hear, don't go there. These are areas whereby these are people just like us. And quite literally, how do we view those people? And that concept of that attitude, that perspective that we use has everything to do with this realization. The giving, the generosity in your heart and in your soul, and how you regard people. So I should mention that while a number of the quotations here drawn heavily on Venerable Master Xingyang, I have drawn on several other writers in the Mahayana tradition in reference to this. So I just wanted to read a couple of quotes right now, but I felt they're very relevant, and I have put them down exactly because these individuals said them better than I could. The 6th realization is awareness that poverty creates more than hatred and anger, which in turn creates more evil. When practicing generosity, Bodhisattvas consider everyone, friends and enemies alike, as equal. They do not condemn anyone's past wrongdoings, nor do they hate those who are presently doing evil. Goes on, when practicing generosity, we should consider everyone equal. Some people think that they can only practice generosity if they are wealthy. This is not true. Some people who are wealthy do practice generosity, but in giving alms, with the attitude of trying to gain merit or profiting or pleasing others. People whose lives are grounded in compassion are seldom rich because they share what they have with others. They are willing to enrich their lives financially at the cost of others' poverty. Many people misunderstand the Buddhist expression practicing generosity to mean when casually giving $1 or $2 to a panhandler on the street. In fact, the practice of generosity is even more beautiful than that. It is both modest and grand. So again, considering the attitude. Practicing generosity means to act in a way that will help equalize the difference between the wealthy and the impoverished. So that will help. Whatever we do to ease human suffering and create social justice can be considered practicing generosity. And this is fundamental to Mahayana. And the term Bodhisattva, which to many might seem to be something of a saint-like capability, I would ask you to consider, much as you might look at the path towards enlightenment, it is all done one step at a time. So the journey, the pathway to our own enlightenment is that one step at a time, whereby one needs to have love for oneself. One needs to have patience with oneself. So very key towards that attitude as we move forward is very much the Bodhisattva. It is not something that is beyond our grasp to be able to start to walk in the footsteps of a Bodhisattva. A Bodhisattva dedicated to helping all sentient beings. So that doesn't mean that you disavow all worldly possessions and move forward. What it means is every day in the present moment, how you look towards others and how you react towards others. So very much straightforwardly that way. And that very much is a very challenging thing for us, but something that we do need to consider as we leave the classroom and go into real life. We're constantly scanning with our eyes and our senses. We're constantly looking at everyone around us. And what invariably happens is as we scan and look around, we are taught to, and we seem to do a very good job of it, of immediately making critical analysis of every sight that we see, of every body that we see, and every circumstance that we see. So as I mentioned here, recognition is the starting point of change. That is the critical element, as I see, of not so much looking at what your first reaction is, if you wish to consider it that, because you can't stop that first reaction. But what you can then do is realize that you've reacted in a certain way, consider and contemplate that, and then turn what is a conscious decision into an unconscious decision by how you act towards others with that generosity of spirit and with that generosity of mind. So I just wanted to read through just a moment here, and I ask for your indulgence because it's a slightly longer passage, but this is within the core teachings. And just want to discuss it because it immediately parallels the sixth realization with the first paramita. And this discusses the paramita. So one of the things I guess I should say before going forward is whenever preparing for any one of these classes, I often turn towards some of the primary materials that when I first came to Dharma class, start looking at. And I look towards, in particular, the core teachers as being the type of book. I remember when I first started coming to class, people said every time they pick it up, they're learning something new. And I thought, yeah, that's well and good. I sat down, I read through the book. I didn't really understand or embody it all, but I got a familiarity with the concepts. And yet every time you pick it up, there is literally a wonder that is in there, not just from what you read, but from where you have progressed to in your cultivation. So as I urge the Wednesday night class, instead of sitting down sometimes and watching another episode of whatever on TV, take out a couple of your books and just lay them on the coffee table. And if you find yourself with nothing to do, and I don't suggest change your habits entirely, but there is an opportunity to be able to sit down and just read something that is a little more wholesome or a little more constructive. Anyway, that's my little plug. So anyway, the practice of the Bodhisattva path. Buddhism is a religion that emphasizes practice. The practice of the Bodhisattva path is just like the process of learning. It goes step by step. From the state of the ordinary person who has afflictions to the state of awakening. Bodhisattvas who has cut off all defilements, there are definite stages of cultivation. In order to reach sagehood, each stage requires the fulfillment of 37 practices leading towards enlightenment, the 4 means of embracing, and the 6 perfections. And I ask you in Buddhism, I'll pause for a second, not to get too hung up into the 6 of this and the 8 of this and the 4 of this. Understand that Buddhism was born, as is another ones of ancient learnings of philosophies, but Buddhism was raised with an oral tradition. The using of the numbers in them helped maintain the memory of that and kept it until it was written down. So don't be too worried whenever it talks about all these numbers that are in there.
Especially the 37.
Especially the 37.
That's a big one.
The 37 practices leading to enlightenment are the 4 applications of mindfulness, the 4 right efforts, the 4 bases of spiritual power, the 5 faculties, the 5 powers, the 7 limbs of enlightenment, the noble Eightfold Path, which I mentioned before. These methods are a resource that can help us cut off unwholesome deeds, develop wholesome conduct, eliminate ignorance, and enter the Bodhi path, the path to enlightenment. For these reasons, the practitioners on the Bodhisattva path should diligently cultivate the 37 practices of enlightenment. On the Bodhisattva path, the most important Dharma method is the 6 perfections, also known as the 6 paramitas. The literal meaning of paramita is having reached the other shore, or having accomplished the goal of enlightenment. The 6 perfections liberate the deluded and lead them to enlightenment, liberate the evil and put them on the right path, liberate all sensual beings from the shore of affliction and ferry them to the other shore of liberation. The 6 perfections constitute the 6 forms of practice that bodhisattvas must realize in order to accomplish Buddhahood. They are the perfection of giving, the perfection of upholding the precepts, the perfection of patience, the perfection of diligence, the perfection of meditation, and the perfection of prajna, wisdom. And I'll just read you the first paramita, or first perfection. The perfection of giving is the generous mind of giving without attachment to form. All forms of giving should be carried out without clinging to what has been given, who is doing the giving, and who is receiving the gift. This is the Bodhisattva's way of giving. And I think that's particularly relevant as, again, we come back to this consideration of what that intention is. And as we look towards one of the aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path, right intention is very much part of it. To be in a position where we do something for somebody with the expectation that they're then going to do something back for us is something that we're actually raised with. It's something that we're taught. And yet here is another way, an alternate way to be able to examine and to look at this. To honestly be in a position to offer somebody comfort, to offer somebody something, even to offer goodwill to that person, but not expect anything back and behind. And it's a very challenging thing when you examine what we do and when we do it. I had an interesting circumstance about 2 months ago where I was actually involved in going through the TTC subway and then getting onto the GO train. And as I was approaching the GO train, there was a mass of commuters all running around. And there was a person who was walking along, a young lady, and thinking back, I guess there must have been some thought that came to my mind right away with some form of substance abuse because she wasn't overly steady on her face. But she fell down and she hit her face and started bleeding on the ground. It was very interesting. The person that I was with, who is not somebody that I would think would naturally be considered a bodhisattva, immediately went to this person. There must have been 100 people standing around at that stage. 2 or 3 literally, their first response without thinking was immediately to go to this person's assistance. There were 3 or 4 that then got drawn in quite quickly. How to call 911, can we get a blanket, where are emergency services? There were 2 or 3 more that then jumped in and attempted to provide comfort to this woman. Now you could see people's minds thinking through about the blood that was there, about how this person was, what this person was. Are there other people helping so I don't need to help? But I guess the thing that after the emergency services were there, it was very interesting then to look around the group. The group that all had an opportunity to help, the group that all had an opportunity to give comfort, and what must have been going through their minds. And as we come to talk about the yeah, but, I can think of all kinds of reasons why not to help that person. But how many of us think about the things as to why you should help that person? And can we develop our cultivation to we're at the point where that is our immediate first response without having to go through that calculation in our mind? And when situations like this happen, this really is the difference between reading the book and having the knowledge and practicing the path. And I'm not going to tell you what your response would have, could have, might have been, because that's a very, very personal decision. We are all worthy of the Dharma. We are all worthy of enlightenment. We all have Buddha nature within us. It is up to us as to how we cultivate, develop, and learn, and where we are on that path. I just mentioned with the core teachings, I read one thing 6 months ago, I look at it, and I see something different coming from the Dharma now. Conditions, karma being such, maybe at one point in your life, you stand on the sidelines. At other points in your life, you participate. But again, the first thing to do is to realize what your reaction is, and don't fool yourself into self-justifying. A shopping cart hits a car in a parking lot. Do you leave a note? Do you just walk away? Do you move the shopping cart? I often think it's funny. I'll open the door for just about anybody walking through. I've received some of the craziest looks from people as I open the door to let them in. It's just a courtesy. Not to put myself anywhere different than anybody else. There are little things that we can choose to do. Pay for the person's coffee behind in Tim Hortons, something that we've talked about within this class. I'm not saying you should do it, but little things that you can do. Sometimes when you do that, the other person can actually react with anger. Why did you do that? What does that mean? What do I have to do? Where can I go? But again, too, that spirit of developing your mind so you can, without thinking, be the compassionate, giving person that you want to be at that point. So that parallel with that first paramita, or that first perfection, the perfection of giving, that mindset of giving, why you give and how you approach things, really does then come home. And you'll find a lot of things from a Buddhist standpoint will have a particular way of discussing things, or points that can bring up, or to be called this or called that, but very often there is that similarity of spirit, that similarity of cultivation that you have. So just a couple other points that I want to read through, and then I do have some questions here, and I think it would be valuable to spend some time discussing these questions, because I'd like your perspectives and your viewpoints on this as well too. So I'll just mention, in the Mahayana tradition, the Bodhisattva exhibits an encompassing compassion that is offered equally to all. The well-being of others is of equal importance to that of self. This may seem contradictory unless one recalls that Buddha made it clear that without caring for ourselves, we would not be able to extend the care and the compassion to others. It is through this practice of generosity of the spirit that practitioners develop the skill, the ability to give of oneself. And I'll just pause here for a moment, because as I look in society today with so many issues of self-esteem, so many issues of people who react with anger, but when you peel away some of the motivations, there is a frustration with themselves, an anger with themselves, a disappointment with themselves that they have felt keenly. So without that ability to love oneself, to have belief in oneself, it is very challenging to take that towards others. And one of my first learnings in coming in this class from Jan, who was one of our previous facilitators, was, again, have patience with yourself as you explore the Dharma and you explore your path. You will make mistakes. You will not always act like a Buddha the first time that you start moving forward. It is a journey. It is one step at a time, as Master Sin Young points out. The key is to be aware of the decisions and the actions you're taking and the steps that you take moving forwards. And that, to me, is always, always critical. So just one more point that I would like to bring out, and then we can either break up into groups or have a larger group question. We'll discuss that in a minute. Intent is a critical aspect of generosity. The intent and attitude of the giver. The intent and spirit of the gift are essential, and the knowledge that the giving will need to end must be taken into account by any situation. The giver should be prompted by the need while being mindful of the encompassing effort their generosity might have. They should not be influenced by possible rewards, material or otherwise, that may come. This is selflessness. So again, too, we've discussed it, but when you do give that, what do I get in return? And that is very, very critical. So, just before we get into it, our practice can simply start from this present moment. If you find yourself in a favorable situation, examine your thoughts, examine your motivations, examine your intent. If greed arises, then catch it. There is an opportunity to modify. If you find yourself in an unfavorable situation, examine your thoughts. Consider your actions, your words, your thoughts, your actions. And when you consider an unfavorable situation, unfavorable thoughts, replace it with right thoughts. Another aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path. Now, there is one more passage, and I will not ask anybody to read it, or I will not read it, but I would urge you to refer to it. I know that you all have copies of the core teachings, and it is just something that I would like to leave you with. It's on page 139, and in my book is, or this version is anyway, but it's in the section under the Noble Eightfold Path, and it is the last section in the chapter called How to Practice the Noble Eightfold Path. And the reason why I ask you to consider this is it talks about how to act on a daily basis, how to act on an ongoing basis, bearing in mind the Noble Eightfold Path, which to me, when embodied, is very much to having the Bodhi mind, the mind of the Bodhisattva, the mind of someone who has giving and generosity in spirit and moving forward. So just before we get to the questions, I would urge all of you, as you leave the classroom and as you go back out into the world at large, to consider your responses to the stimuli that's out there. When you see somebody driving a rusty car, what do you think? When you see somebody driving a Ferrari, what do you think? When you see somebody walking along, when you do something that you seem to immediately react as unfavorable, what is your state of mind as you're doing that? What is the reaction and what is your instant response? And I would urge you, rather than either thinking or verbal, I would urge all of you to pause for a moment and contemplate that response and hold it up against the person you want to be and hold it up against the Dharma and see if it is consistent in moving forward. From our discussion's point of view, not the right and wrong, but I think the consideration of the term friend and foe, and as Wood said, ultimately we hope to arrive at the point where those two terms are meaningless. I think we do start out with the realization. We do start out with an acknowledgement of what our reaction is and an understanding of what that reaction is. And there's been comments in the class before about workplace. And oftentimes there will be somebody within your workplace that you don't particularly get along with, be it a boss or be it a co-worker, almost an adversarial position, dare I say faux position. And yet very often when you're in that situation, if you do not actively participate in that argument, if you do maintain more of a quiet, if you do maintain less of an aggressive stance to that person, it's very interesting because you need two people to have an argument. So what happens when you are not that one person standing there participating in that argument? That you realize that that person who cut you off in traffic might be racing to the hospital for their child's treatment. that you try to understand things with a compassionate mind behind. Try not to be consistently, ongoingly focused on the self and your needs. The purpose of this question wasn't to say, if somebody struck you, do you embrace them? The purpose of this is to say, do you consider that that person is a human being worthy of love, worthy of Dharma, worthy of the enlightenment of moving ahead, and think of the challenges that person has in front of them to find that path. I often look at people who, and you hear it all the time for some reason, who somebody is on literally their deathbed, and it's a brother that they haven't talked to for 40 years. They can't even remember why they had the argument that caused them not to fight. And yet all of a sudden, when the end is near, or when there's a circumstance happening, they then want to embrace that again. Not just, I would argue, at the point of passing, but really it brings into mind how silly these little arguments, how silly these little things are that can happen in our lives with that friend and so-called foe. So I think that it's important to recognize that in our current state of mind, it's hard to think of embracing a foe. But I do think that with the realization of what your reaction is, with the responsibility of knowing we can change and modify our own responses, we can choose as to how we perceive that person. The biggest thing that I would probably comment is the one line that I hear, and it always makes me smile. I probably smile because I'd rather not cry, and that is when people say, that's just the way I am. And recognizing from a Buddhist perspective, there is no such thing. We are who we choose to be. We can scream and fight. Somebody steps on your toe, your first response can be to strike out at them verbally or physically, or you can look at them and just say, no problem. Not to say that you're somebody who can just absorb anything, but using it as you don't know what they're going through or where they are. One of the great lessons of Gandhi through the act of nonviolence was to maintain his integrity, to understand how the world can change one step at a time. So I think that is very powerful. So we're just coming almost to the end of the class, and I wanted to give Martin a chance to talk about the next class, just if you had any words or readings to do, and also Sifu, if there was anything Sifu wanted to say. I know we've got some events upcoming that you might want to address, so I'll just ask you to be prepared to talk to them. But what I did want to pass on to the class is I'll never forget that we had somebody in class one day say, I work for a marketing company, and our marketing company says all these things and makes all these claims for the products that we do. How am I to maintain a lifestyle from a Dharma point of view? How am I to maintain truth and integrity if I work for a company that somehow is trying to cover this up on an ongoing point of view? Somebody that he doesn't feel that they're telling the truth. And I think part of that is just, can the corporate world or the business world act with proper giving and proper spirit of generosity? So I'm not making definitive statements on these, but I will just mention a couple examples. The first one is Dr. Jonas Salk. Don't know whether anybody recognizes the name, but he is the inventor of the polio vaccine, who was, when he was approached in the 1850s and he was asked to put a patent on this, he said no, he wouldn't, because he wanted it to benefit mankind. The reason why it came up, and as I was looking through the studies the other day, is it was estimated that that patent, had it been put on, would have made $7 billion by this point. Just thought that was very interesting, but somebody who focused on that. And just before class, a couple of us were here, we were talking about the Tesla Corporation with the electric cars, and the individual who owns that, Elon Musk, they have just been in a position whereby their electric car technology is protected by a whole series of patents, and he has just released all those patents to the world to make it available for other companies, and all the major car manufacturers are now in touch with him with joint cooperative ventures. The thought being here is the price of his stock of his company did go up. His car company will be in a much more advantageous position because there'll be more electric filling stations and so forth. But the point cannot be taken away that the potential impact of this removal of patents from what would happen to the environment, decreasing the fossil fuels, can without a doubt be his primary goal. So I do believe that companies, corporate and business, even countries, can act with a generous or given state of mind. But it does take all the individuals inside to be willing to participate and to want to go in that direction. But it is conscious decisions. We don't turn our mind on and off at that point. So anyway, thank you all for your attention. Very much appreciate it.